The wind had a way of speaking in that country. It was not a whisper, but a long, mournful cry that swept down from the granite teeth of the mountains and across the plains. It scoured the land, peeling paint from the bones of abandoned homesteads and whistling through the skeletal remains of burned-out wagons. This was the voice Wade Thatcher had come to know better than any humans. It spoke of endings, of things lost to fire and drought and the simple, brutal greed of men. He rode a dust-colored gelding that moved with the same weary patience as its rider. Wade's face was a map of hard miles, the lines around his eyes etched by a sun that gave no quarter, the set of his jaw fixed by memories that offered no peace. He was a tall man, lean in the saddle, with the kind of stillness that could be mistaken for calm. It was not calm. It was a fence he had built around himself, 100 miles of wire and posts meant to keep the world out, and the ghosts in. He had been a cavalry scout once, young enough to believe in the purpose of a uniform and the clarity of an order. He learned differently. He had been a rancher's son, with a father who believed in the promise of the land and a mother who could make a home out of little more than canvas and hope. Then came the land war, a fever of forged deeds and midnight raids that consumed everything he had ever called his own. He had been away, scouting a pass for the army, when the letter found him, its words blunt as a spade to the back of the head. He was too far away, too powerless. He had buried them in his mind, but they never stayed buried. They walked with him, silent figures against a backdrop of fire. The landscape offered no comfort. It was a testament to failure. He passed a shallow grave marked by a pile of stones, the final resting place of some hopeful traveler whose luck had run out. Further on, the desiccated carcass of a cow lay tangled in a barbed wire fence, its bones picked clean by coyotes and vultures. This was a land that swallowed dreams and left nothing behind but the hard, bitter truth of survival. Towns were no better. They were just bigger corrals for the same desperate animals, full of dust and suspicion, where a man's worth was measured by the weight of his purse or the speed of his draw. He was aiming for no place in particular, just moving west, a habit he could not break. He followed the sun as if it might one day burn the chill from his soul. On the horizon, a smudge of smoke and crude structures announced the presence of one such town. Calico Ridge, the sign would probably read, another boomtown clinging to the side of a hill like a desperate tick. Gold or silver. It made no difference. The sickness it bred was always the same. Before the first shacks of the town proper, he saw them. 3 men, 2 on their feet, 1 on the ground. The man on the ground was a miner by the look of him, his clothes caked with mud and his face a bloody ruin. One of the men standing over him wore a tarnished star pinned to his vest. The sheriff. He was a thick, florid man with a gut that strained the buttons of his shirt and a cruel twist to his mouth. The other was his deputy, a younger, leaner version of the same meanness. The sheriff drove the toe of his boot into the miner's ribs. A wet, choked sound came from the man on the ground. "I told you, scrabbler," the sheriff said, his voice greasy with satisfaction. "Your claim ain't valid, not until you pay the town tax, and it seems you're a little short." "I paid," the miner rasped, spitting a pink froth onto the dirt. "I paid Hargreaves. Hargreaves runs the saloon, not the law." The sheriff grunted and kicked him again. "Now, are you going to pay me? Or am I going to have to haul your worthless hide to a cell?" Wade had reined in his horse, watching from 50 yards out. His first instinct, the one that had been his companion for a decade, was to ride on. It was not his fight. He had learned the hard way what came of stepping into other men's battles. It got people killed. It got hopes shattered. It left you with nothing but another ghost to carry. He nudged his horse forward, his eyes on the horizon, ready to leave the scene to fade behind him. But then the deputy drew his pistol and pressed the barrel to the miner's temple. "Maybe we should just save the taxpayers the cost of a meal." "Sheriff." Something inside Wade snapped. A wire pulled too tight for too long. He did not think. He simply acted. He slid from the saddle, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He walked toward them, his movements fluid and unhurried. "That's enough," he said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the air like a thrown knife. The sheriff and his deputy turned, surprised. They had not heard his approach. They saw a tall drifter in a worn duster, a man who looked like he had been part of the landscape forever. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Who in the hell are you? This is official town business. Ride on." "Let the man go," Wade said. His hands were loose at his sides. His gaze was flat and empty, fixed on the star on the sheriff's chest. The deputy chuckled, a thin, nervous sound. "You deaf, mister? The sheriff told you to ride on." Wade's eyes flickered to the deputy, and for the first time, the younger man felt a prickle of genuine fear. There was nothing in that gaze. No anger, no bravado. It was the look of a man looking at a fence post he was about to tear down. "I heard him," Wade said. He took another step forward. The sheriff, a man used to bullying and bluster, grew red in the face. "You're interfering with the law in Calico Ridge. That's a good way to get yourself shot." "Your law?" Wade's voice was barely a whisper. "Or your pocket." The insult hit its mark. The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun. It was a clumsy, telegraphed motion, born of arrogance and slow reflexes. Wade's hand was a blur. The heavy Colt revolver seemed to appear in it from nowhere. He did not point it. He simply held it, the barrel angled toward the ground. But the loud, clean click as he cocked the hammer was all the threat required. The sheriff froze, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. The deputy, who had a clearer view of the stranger's eyes, slowly, carefully, took the barrel of his own gun away from the miner's head. "Now," Wade said, his voice still low, "you're going to help him up, and then you're going to walk away." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind and the wheezing breath of the beaten miner. The sheriff was calculating his odds. He was the law here, but the man in front of him did not look like he cared much for laws. He looked like he cared only for endings. Finally, with a venomous glare, the sheriff spat on the ground. "All right, Drifter, have it your way." He gestured to his deputy. "Get him up." They hauled the miner to his feet. The man could barely stand, his body trembling with pain and fear. He looked at Wade with wide, grateful eyes. "You have a horse?" Wade asked the miner, his own gun never wavering. The man nodded weakly toward a sad-looking mule tethered to a scrubby bush. "Get on it. Ride east. Don't stop until you're well clear of this county." The miner stumbled toward his mule, hoisted himself into the saddle, and kicked the animal into a shambling trot, not once looking back. Wade kept his gun on the two lawmen until the miner was a distant shape. Then, he uncocked the Colt and slid it back into its holster. The sheriff watched him, his face a mask of fury. "You just made a mistake, friend, a big one. Ransom Hargreaves owns this town, and he don't like people meddling in his business. You'd be smart to get on that horse of yours and follow that scrabbler." "I'll keep that in mind," Wade said, turning his back on them and walking to his horse. It was a deliberate act of contempt. He mounted up and, without a backward glance, rode into Calico Ridge. The warning was clear. He had meddled, and in a town like this, meddling was a debt that would be collected. The town itself was what he had expected, a main street of raw, unpainted buildings, their fronts false and ambitious. Flanked by a sea of tents and shanties, the street was churned mud, drying to a fine, choking dust that coated everything. Men with hard, hollowed-out eyes watched him pass, their gazes lingering on his gun, his horse, his saddlebags. Every face was a ledger of want and suspicion. This was not a place to build a life. It was a place to have it stripped from you, one miserable piece at a time. He dismounted in front of the livery and paid the stable hand a coin to water and feed his horse. He needed a drink and maybe a hot meal. There was only one place in town that looked like it could offer both: the Grand Palace Saloon. The name was a joke. It was the biggest building on the street, but it was just as crude as the others, its batwing doors swinging open and closed, spilling the sounds of a tinny piano and coarse laughter into the street. The inside was a haze of cigar smoke and the stink of cheap whiskey. Sweat and unwashed bodies. Miners, gamblers, and drifters crowded the bar and the tables, their voices loud and desperate. Wade made his way to a small, empty table in a shadowed corner, a spot where he could watch the room without being easily seen. He ordered a whiskey from a harried barmaid and nursed it, letting the burn of the liquor do little to warm the cold knot in his gut. He was just a man passing through. That is what he told himself. He would have his drink, eat some stew if they had it, and be on his way by morning. No more meddling, no more trouble. He had paid that price once before and sworn he never would again. It was then that he saw her. She was on a small, rick-backed stage at the far end of the room, a guitar held awkwardly in her hands. The spotlight from a single smoky oil lamp illuminated her, setting her apart from the grime and shadows of the saloon. She was not beautiful in the way of the painted women who worked the tables. Her face was pale and thin, her dress a faded calico that had seen better days. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a deep, clear blue, the color of a mountain lake, but they were distant, looking out at the crowd as if seeing something else entirely, something far away and long gone. Her body was rigid, a fine tremor running through her that even from across the room he could see. When she began to sing, her voice was as hollow as a dead tree. It was a sad, simple ballad about a lost love, and the notes were thin and fragile, threatening to break at any moment. He watched her, a strange tightness in his chest. She did not belong here. It was as plain as the fear in her eyes. This was not a performer playing a part. This was a prisoner on display. Two men at a nearby table were talking, their voices low but audible over the din. "A real shame, that one," the older man said, nodding toward the stage. "That's Lena Calder." "Don't know the name," his companion replied. "You wouldn't. You're new. Her family owned the prettiest spread in this valley. The Double C, good people. Her PA, Thomas, was a fair man, but he wouldn't sell to Hargreaves when the silver strike came. Said the land was for cattle, not for digging." The man took a long drink of his beer. "Next thing you know, Thomas and his wife are found dead. Bushwhacked, the sheriff said. Deeds to the ranch turned up with Hargreaves' name on them. Forged. Anyone with half an eye could see, but the sheriff saw what he was paid to see." The younger man grunted. "And the girl?" "Hargreaves accused her of stealing from her own family's estate to pay off some made-up debt. Trumped-up charges. Of course. The judge, another one of Hargreaves' men, found her guilty, sentenced her to work off the debt right here, in his service." The man's voice dropped to a disgusted whisper. "Sold her, is what he did. Sold a fine, proud rancher's daughter into servitude, right here in front of us all." Wade's hand tightened around his glass. Ransom Hargreaves, the name the sheriff had mentioned. The man who owned this town. He looked around the room and saw him then, standing near the end of the bar. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the rough-spun clothes of his patrons. He had a handsome, predatory face, with cold, watchful eyes that missed nothing. He was watching Lena on the stage, not with appreciation, but with the flat, assessing gaze of a man counting his assets. When Lena finished her song, the applause was sparse and distracted. She gave a small, jerky curtsy and started to step down from the stage. Hargreaves moved to intercept her. He grabbed her arm, his grip too tight. Wade saw her flinch, a sharp, involuntary jerk of her body. "You're not done," Hargreaves said, his voice a low command. "Sing another." "My throat is sore." "Mr. Hargreaves," she said, her own voice barely audible. She did not look at him. She looked at the floor. "I did not ask about your throat," he said, his fingers digging into her arm. "I said sing." He gave her a rough shove back toward the center of the stage. She stumbled, catching herself before she fell. Her face was a white mask of humiliation and fear. Wade watched it all from his corner. He did not move. His jaw was so tight his teeth ached. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, flashed through his mind. Another time, another place. A woman named Mary, with a laugh like wind chimes and eyes full of a future he was supposed to be in. They were in a town just like this one, full of rough men and easy violence. A card game had gone bad. A man had accused her brother of cheating. Wade, younger then, more cautious, had tried to talk his way through it, to de-escalate, to find a peaceful solution. He had waited a moment too long. A gun was drawn. Mary, trying to step between them, had caught the bullet. She had died in his arms, her last breath a confused sigh, her eyes looking at him with a question he could never answer. He had acted too late. He had buried her, and with her, he had buried that part of himself. He had promised her spirit, the wind, and whatever God might be listening, that he would never get involved again. Love, attachment, fighting for others. It all led to the same place, a shallow grave on a lonely hill. So he sat now, a statue of stone in a corner of a noisy saloon, and did nothing. He was just a man passing through. Lena picked up the guitar again. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely form the chords. She started another song, her voice even more broken than before. It was a mournful tune, a lament for a life that was gone. The crowd paid it no mind, their laughter and shouting nearly drowning it out. But then she sang a line that cut through the noise and struck Wade like a physical blow. Her eyes were closed, and for a moment, the fear on her face was replaced by a profound and bottomless sorrow. She sang, her voice cracking with an emotion so raw it felt like a wound. "I don't want to forget tonight, even if it's just pain." Wade lifted his head. The whiskey glass was still in his hand, but he was no longer aware of it. The line echoed in the silent, haunted chambers of his own heart. He knew what it meant, to hold on to the pain because it was the only thing left. The pain was proof that something had existed, that it had been real. To forget the pain would be to forget the love, the hope, the life that came before it. It would be the final death. He looked at her, truly looked at her then. He saw not just a victim, but a survivor, a woman fighting in the only way she had left, clinging to the memory of who she was, even if that memory was nothing but agony. She was not just a girl being abused by a powerful man. She was a soul refusing to be extinguished. The song ended. Lena stood for a moment, swaying slightly, then walked off the stage and disappeared through a door behind the bar. Hargreaves watched her go, a smug look of ownership on his face. Wade stood up. He threw a coin on the table, more than enough to cover the drink. He turned and walked toward the bat-wing doors, his movements as silent and deliberate as they had been when he faced the sheriff. He did not look at Hargreaves. He did not look at anyone. He pushed through the doors and stepped out into the cold night air. The dust and the wind greeted him like old friends. He had not said a word to her. He had not offered a shred of help. He had kept his promise to himself. He had not gotten involved. But as he walked toward the livery to check on his horse, it was not the memory of Mary's dying breath that haunted him. It was the clear, blue, distant eyes of the girl on the stage. He remembered her eyes, and he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like the winter cold, that he would not be leaving Calico Ridge in the morning. Morning came to Calico Ridge not with the gentle blush of dawn, but as a harsh, gray light that revealed the town's grime in unforgiving detail. Wade Thatcher had spent the night in the livery loft, the scent of hay and horse a more honest comfort than any boarding-house bed. He had not slept. The image of Lena Calder's face, a pale mask of sorrow, was burned into the back of his eyes. The promise he had made to himself years ago felt like a fraying rope. When the town began to stir, he did not ride out. Instead, he began a slow, deliberate reconnaissance, the old habits of a scout taking over. He was a ghost, a shadow moving along the edges of the town's life. He bought a newspaper he did not read at the general store, lingering by the counter to listen as two prospectors grumbled about the exorbitant fees Hargreaves charged through his assessor's office. He learned that Sheriff Miller was not just on Hargreaves's payroll, but was his cousin, a fact that explained the tarnished star and the lazy brutality. He walked past the land registry office, a small, dusty shack with a sleepy clerk. Through the grimy window, he could see the county ledger book lying open. It would be in there, the proof of the Calder Ranch's theft, a few strokes of a pen that had ended a family and condemned a daughter. He saw how easily it was done, how a man with enough money could purchase not just land, but the law itself. Justice here was a commodity, and Ransom Hargreaves had a monopoly. His wandering eventually led him to the source of the town's only constant, rhythmic noise, the clang of a hammer on an anvil. The blacksmith shop was a wide, open-fronted structure, its interior glowing with the fierce heart of the forge. The man working the bellows was old, his hair a close-cropped silver, his skin the color of rich, dark earth. His arms, bare to the shoulder, were a testament to a life of heavy labor, corded with muscle that age had not yet managed to soften. He moved with a steady, practiced grace, his expression one of deep concentration. Wade stood in the shadows of the doorway, watching. The blacksmith finished heating a horseshoe, pulled it glowing from the coals, and began to shape it with swift, precise blows. The ringing of the hammer was a clean, honest sound in a town full of lies. After a few moments, the blacksmith plunged the shoe into a quenching tub. Steam hissed violently, and in the sudden quiet, the old man looked up, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He had known Wade was there all along. "Something you need, mister?" he asked. His voice was a low, deep rumble, like stones moving at the bottom of a river. "Just watching," Wade said, stepping into the light. The blacksmith nodded, his eyes taking in Wade's worn clothes, the gun on his hip, and the stillness in his posture. "Most folks who come to Calico Ridge are in a hurry, running from something or running to something. You don't look like you're in a hurry." "I've learned it doesn't get you anywhere faster," Wade replied. The man grunted, a sound that might have been agreement. "The name's Elijah." He did not offer a hand, but the introduction was a clear invitation. "Wade." Elijah picked up another piece of iron with his tongs and thrust it into the forge. "Saw you yesterday, with Miller and his pup?" Wade said nothing. "That was a fool thing to do," Elijah continued, his eyes on the heating metal. "A brave thing, but a fool thing. You made an enemy of the man who holds the leash on this town's dogs." "I've made enemies before." "Not like Hargreaves," Elijah said, turning to look Wade full in the face. "This ain't just a man, son. It's a sickness. He came here with a silver tongue and a pocket full of bribes, and he bought this hill, lock, stock, and barrel. The mine, the law, the land office. He owns it all." He gestured with his head in the direction of the saloon. "He owns people, too." The unspoken name hung in the hot air between them. "Lena Calder." "I know her story," Wade said, his voice low. Elijah's gaze softened with a profound sadness. "Then you know there ain't a sadder one in this whole territory. I knew her PA. Thomas, he was a good man. Stood with me once when some hotheads tried to run me out of town on account of my skin. Said a man's worth is in his hands and his heart, not his color. This town, it killed that goodness, buried it." He pulled the glowing iron from the fire. "You look like a man who knows how to handle himself, but there's nothing for you here but trouble. My advice, get on your horse and ride away. Don't look back. Some fights ain't meant to be won." Wade watched the old man work, the muscles in his back flexing under his sweat-slicked skin. Elijah was a veteran of some long-ago war, Wade guessed. A man who had seen the worst of what men could do to each other and had chosen to build things rather than break them. His advice was wise. It was the same advice Wade had been giving himself for 10 years. "I appreciate the warning, Elijah," Wade said. He turned to leave. "Mister," Elijah called out, stopping him. "That girl, she ain't like the others. She's got a fire in her still. All Hargreaves has managed to do is bank it down with ashes. But a banked fire can still burn a house down." Wade nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, and then walked back into the dusty street. He spent the rest of the day in the shadows, a silent observer of Lena's prison. He saw her emerge from the back of the saloon to empty a bucket of filthy water into the alley. She moved with a slight limp he had not noticed the night before, a stiffness in her left leg, as if from an old, poorly healed injury. Later, he saw her scrubbing the saloon's front steps on her hands and knees, her knuckles red and raw. Men walking past made lewd comments. She did not look up, her face a blank, emotionless mask, but Wade saw the tightening of her jaw, the way her shoulders hunched as if to ward off blows. On her cheek, just below her eye, was a faint, purplish bruise, the kind a man's knuckles might leave. It was fresh. It was from Hargreaves. She began to notice him. At first, it was just a fleeting awareness, the sense of being watched, but his stillness made him stand out. The other men in town were loud, restless, their eyes always moving, always calculating. This man was different. He would be across the street, leaning against a post, his hat pulled low, or he would be sitting on a bench outside the general store, seeming to do nothing at all. He never stared, not in the predatory way she was used to. His gaze was unnervingly steady, and she could not read it. Fear was her constant companion, and so she feared him. He was a drifter, a gunman by the look of him. Men like that were dangerous and unpredictable. They took what they wanted. Maybe he was one of Hargreaves's new men, hired to watch her. But then why did he look at Hargreaves with such contempt? She had seen him do it. A fleeting glance as the saloon owner passed, a look of such cold, quiet hatred it made her shiver. A part of her, the small, foolish part that still remembered hope, began to feel a sliver of intrigue. He was a puzzle, a stone dropped into the stagnant pond of her life, and the ripples he made were unsettling. As evening fell, the saloon began to fill up again, and the tinny piano started its nightly assault. Wade was in his corner, nursing a beer, when a new patron arrived. He was a gambler from the look of him, dressed in a silk vest and a string tie, his fingers dripping with rings. He was loud and ostentatious, and he carried the easy arrogance of a man with a fat wallet. Hargreaves greeted him personally, clasping his shoulder and leading him to a private table. They drank and talked for an hour, their heads close together. Wade watched them, his senses on high alert. He saw money pass from the gambler to Hargreaves, a thick fold of bills. Then Hargreaves nodded toward the back room where Lena had disappeared after her song the night before. The gambler smiled, a slick, unpleasant baring of teeth. The deal was done. Hargreaves found Lena in the kitchen. Wade could not see them, but he heard the confrontation. Hargreaves's low, commanding tone, and then Lena's voice, rising in panic and disbelief. "No," she said, her voice sharp with desperation. "Not for a weekend. Not with him. I will not." "You will do as you are told." Hargreaves' voice was like ice. "You are my property, and I have rented you out. I am not your property." Then came the sound of a struggle, a chair scraping across the floor, and then Lena's voice, a single, piercing scream of pure terror and defiance. It was a sound that ripped through the saloon, silencing the piano and the laughter for a brief, stunned moment. Then the noise rushed back in, a tide of deliberate ignorance as men turned back to their drinks, not wanting to get involved. Wade was on his feet, his hand on his gun, before he even realized he had moved. The promise he had made, The walls he had built crumbled to dust in the face of that scream. But he stopped himself. Charging in would be suicide. It would get him killed, and it would not save her. It might even make things worse for her. He was a scout, a planner. The rage was a fire in his chest. But he forced it down, turning it into something cold and hard. He needed to think. He saw Hargreaves drag Lena out of the kitchen. She fought him, kicking and scratching, her face wild with terror. He was too strong for her. He pulled her down a narrow flight of stairs behind the bar that led to the cellar. Wade heard the heavy bolt of the door slide shut, followed by the muffled sound of her desperate sobs. Hargreaves emerged, straightening his suit, his face flushed with anger. He said something to the bartender, then walked toward a back office, the one where he conducted his private business. The gambler remained at his table, sipping his whiskey, an impatient, proprietary look on his face. He would collect his purchase in the morning. Wade moved. He slipped out the side door of the saloon and circled around to the alley. He found the back window of the office. It was dark, but a thin line of light shone from under the door. He listened. Inside, he could hear the rustle of papers and the clink of coins. Hargreaves was counting his money. The price of a ranch, the price of a sheriff, the price of a human soul. Wade stayed there for a long time, the cold of the night seeping into his bones. But the cold inside him was far deeper. He was no longer just a witness. He was forming a plan. As he stood there in the darkness, another memory rose unbidden, this one older and more jagged than the one of Mary. He was a young cavalry scout, barely 20, part of a patrol in Apache territory. They had found a small, hidden camp, an old man, a woman, and a small boy. His commanding officer, a lieutenant full of whiskey and ambition, had ordered them to be taken. The woman had fought with the fury of a cornered cat, trying to protect her child. Wade had seen the terror in her eyes, the same terror he had just seen in Lena's. Against orders, he had tried to intervene, to calm the situation. He spoke a few words of the Apache language he knew, promising her no harm. For a moment, it had worked. She had quieted, clinging to her son. But the lieutenant saw it as a challenge to his authority. He had struck Wade, sending him reeling. In that moment of chaos, the patrol was ambushed by a small band of Apache warriors who had been hunting nearby. It was a short, brutal fight. When the dust settled, the lieutenant was dead, along with 2 other troopers, and the woman and her child, caught in the crossfire, lay still in the dust. Reinforcements, which the lieutenant had sworn were only an hour behind, never came. He had been lying, pushing his patrol too far in search of glory. Wade had disobeyed orders to protect them, and they had died anyway. His compassion had achieved nothing. It had only added to the body count. That failure had become the defining moment of his life. It was the wound that never healed, the ghost that rode with him every mile. It was the reason he had sworn off attachments, the reason he had wandered ever since, refusing to put down roots, refusing peace. He believed his very presence brought ruin. The light in the office window went out. Hargreaves left, locking the door behind him. The town settled into a drunken, uneasy slumber. Wade made his way back to the front of the saloon. It was closed now, dark and silent. He crept to the side of the building, to the low, grated window of the cellar. He knelt down, his ear close to the cold iron. At first, he heard nothing. Then, he heard it, a soft, broken sound. She was crying, not the wild, desperate sobs from before, but a quiet, hopeless weeping that was far more terrible to hear. He listened, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, and then he heard her whisper to herself, her voice thick with tears, a vow made to the darkness and the dirt-walled prison around her. "They can take everything," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of defiance. "Everything, but I don't want to forget who I was." Wade closed his eyes. Her words were an echo of her song, an echo of the silent creed he himself lived by. To remember the pain was to remember the person you had been before it broke you. In that moment, kneeling in the dirt outside her cell, the last of his reservations turned to ash and blew away on the cold night wind. He was no longer a drifter passing through. He was a man with a purpose. He would not let Ransom Hargreaves extinguish the last fire in Lena Calder. He would get her out. He did not know what would happen after, but for tonight, that was enough. The dead hour before dawn was the coldest. It was the hour when the drunks were asleep and the righteous had not yet woken, when a town like Calico Ridge held its breath in a shallow, uneasy slumber. This was the time Wade Thatcher chose. He moved through the alleyways like a wraith, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He carried a short, heavy pry bar he had taken from the livery. The cellar door was on the side of the saloon, a heavy, slanted affair secured by a thick hasp and a formidable padlock. For most men, it would have been an insurmountable obstacle. For a man who had spent years learning how to dismantle the things that were meant to keep people in or out, it was a simple mechanical problem. He did not rush. He worked the tip of the pry bar into the wood around the hasp, testing for weakness. He found it where the screws bit into the weathered frame, with slow, controlled pressure. He began to work the hasp away from the door jamb. The wood groaned in protest, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. He froze, listening. Nothing. Only the incessant wind. He applied more pressure. With a final, splintering shriek, the screws tore free. He lifted the heavy door just enough to slip inside, then lowered it carefully, plunging himself into the cool, damp darkness. The air smelled of sour wine, earth, and despair. A sliver of moonlight from the grated window gave the cellar a faint, ghostly illumination. He saw her then, huddled in the far corner, a small, dark shape against the stone wall. She was not crying anymore. She was sitting with her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, her gaze fixed on the door. She had heard him. When he took a step toward her, she scrambled backward, pressing herself into the corner as if she could merge with the stone. Her eyes were wide with terror in the gloom. She expected Hargreaves, or the gambler, or some new horror. "Quiet!" Wade's voice was a low rumble, not much more than a breath. "I am getting you out of here." She stared at him, her body rigid. He was the man from the saloon, the silent watcher. She did not know his name. She did not know his intentions. In her world, a man appearing in her cell in the middle of the night meant only one thing. Her silence was not one of compliance, but of paralyzing fear. He did not offer a hand. He knew she would not take it. He simply turned and led the way to the door. "Come on, there is not much time." For a long moment, she did not move. To stay was a certainty of violation and pain. To go with this stranger was to step into an unknown abyss. He was armed. He was powerful. He could do anything he wanted to her out in the darkness. But then she remembered her own whispered words. "I don't want to forget who I was, the person she was." The daughter of Thomas Calder would not cower in a cellar waiting to be used like an animal. She would take the abyss. Slowly, stiffly. She got to her feet. She followed him, keeping a careful distance. Every muscle in her body tensed to run, to fight, to scream. They emerged into the biting pre-dawn air. He led her away from the main street, sticking to the shadows, their path a winding, circuitous route that ended at the blacksmith's shop. The big front doors were closed, but a smaller one at the side was unlatched. He pushed it open and ushered her inside. The forge was cold, its great heart dormant. The large space was filled with the looming, alien shapes of tools and works in progress. The air smelled of coal smoke and hot iron. From the loft above, a deep voice called down, "That you, Wade?" "It's me, Elijah," Wade answered. A moment later, the old blacksmith descended the ladder, a heavy blanket draped over his arm. He carried a lantern that cast long, dancing shadows. He looked at Lena, his wise eyes taking in her torn dress, the bruise on her cheek, and the terror that still clung to her like a shroud. He showed no surprise. He simply nodded, his expression a mixture of profound sorrow and grim understanding. "The loft," he said, his voice gentle. "There is clean hay. And this—" He handed the blanket to Wade. He looked at Lena again. "You are safe here, child, for tonight." He then turned, and without another word, climbed back up the ladder to give them their privacy, a silent, unquestioning act of grace. Wade gestured toward a different ladder that led to the stable's main hayloft. "Up there, it is warm." Lena hesitated. She had been moved from one cage to another, this one larger and filled with different shadows. This man, with his silence and his gun, was just another unknown quantity in a world that had taught her that all quantities were dangerous. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, seeing the fear in her eyes. His voice was flat, a simple statement of fact, but it held no reassurance for her. Men had told her that before. Still, she climbed. The hay was thick and soft, and the warmth of the animals below seeped up through the floorboards. It was the first real warmth she had felt in months. Wade followed, bringing the blanket. He did not come close to her. He set the blanket down several feet away and then retreated to the far side of the loft, settling with his back against a post where he could watch the stable doors. Lena wrapped the coarse wool blanket around her shoulders. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. She watched him, waiting for the demand, the price for her rescue. It was how things worked. Nothing was ever given freely. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low. "There is a saddlebag by the ladder. It has jerky and a canteen of water." He paused. "In the morning, you can take my horse. Ride south. Stay off the main roads. You can make it to the territorial line in 3 days if you push it." She stared at his silhouette in the darkness. He was offering her a way out, a real one. The thought was so foreign, so impossible, that she could not process it. Suspicion, her oldest and most reliable friend, coiled in her gut. "Why?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "What do you want from me?" He was silent for a long time. So long she thought he would not answer. "I want nothing," he said finally. "Men always want something," she countered, the bitterness of her experience coating the words. She had been currency for so long. She had forgotten she could be anything else. He did not argue with her. He simply sat in the darkness, a silent, brooding presence. She did not eat. She did not drink. She sat huddled in the blanket, listening to the sounds of the sleeping horses below and the quiet, steady breathing of the man across the loft, and she waited for the sun to come up. It was Sheriff Miller's voice that woke her. She had dozed off, exhaustion finally claiming her, and the harsh, angry sound from the street outside jerked her back to a state of heart-pounding terror. "Elijah, open up in there. We are looking for Hargreaves's girl." Lena scrambled back into the deepest shadows of the loft, her breath catching in her throat. Wade was already awake. Or perhaps he had never slept. He was crouched by the edge of the loft, peering through a crack in the boards, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. Down below, they heard the heavy bar on the main doors being lifted. Elijah's calm, deep voice filled the space. "Something I can help you with. Sheriff?" "Do not play dumb with me, old man," Miller snarled. "The Calder girl is gone, slipped out of the cellar sometime last night. We are searching the town. Have you seen her?" "I have been in my bed above the forge since I closed up last night," Elijah said, his voice even. "The only females I have seen are the mayor's wife's mare that needs a new shoe and your deputy's sister, who seems to find a reason to walk past my shop a dozen times a day. I have seen nothing of the girl you are looking for." The deputy, who was with Miller, let out a nervous cough. "Now, see here, Elijah." "You calling my sister a liar?" Elijah's voice took on a hard edge. "Or are you calling me one?" "We are just doing our job," Miller said impatiently. "We need to search your shop." "Be my guest," Elijah said. "But if you disturb my work or spook the animals, The bill will go to the town. I've got 3 freight wagons that need their wheels re-rimmed by noon, and they pay in cash, which is more than the town council does. They could hear the lawmen tramping around below, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Lena held her breath, certain they would find the ladder. Wade did not move a muscle. He was as still as the granite mountains that ringed the valley. Finally! Miller's frustrated voice echoed up to them. She is not here. Come on, let's check the abandoned claims up the creek. The footsteps retreated. The big doors boomed shut, and the bar was dropped back into place. The silence that followed was a fragile, precious thing. An hour later, Wade procured a worn wool coat and a pair of sturdy, second-hand boots from a sympathetic miner's wife Elijah knew. He paid for them with one of the few silver dollars he had left. He gave them to Lena without a word. The coat was too big, but it was warm. The boots were scuffed but solid, a world away from the flimsy slippers she had been forced to wear. The simple, practical charity of it was more confusing to her than a threat would have been. He led her out the back of the stable to where his gelding was saddled and waiting. He swung himself up, then reached down a hand to her. She looked at his calloused, capable hand, then up at his unreadable face. She took it. His grip was firm and impersonal as he pulled her up to sit behind him. They rode out of Calico Ridge not south, as he had suggested for her, but west, into the desolate, broken country of the desert brush. He guided the horse through dry washes and narrow canyons, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape, choosing a path that would leave the faintest trail. They rode all day, the sun beating down on them, the silence broken only by the plodding of the horse and the whisper of the wind. Lena's initial fear began to slowly recede, replaced by a weary curiosity. The man in front of her was a paradox. He was a killer. She had seen the efficient way he handled his gun. He was a drifter, a man with no ties. Yet he had risked his life for her, and now he was leading her to where, she did not know. That night, they made a cold camp in a hollow of rocks that shielded them from the wind. He built a small, smokeless fire, a scout's fire, just big enough to warm their hands and boil a small pot of coffee. He gave her the larger share of the jerky. They ate in silence, the vast, star-dusted canopy of the desert sky arching over them. The silence was different now. It was no longer a heavy, suspicious thing, but a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared isolation. She looked at him across the flickering flames. His face was stark in the firelight, all hard angles and shadows. The ghosts he carried were almost visible in the depths of his eyes. Why? She asked again, but this time the question was different. It was not an accusation, but a genuine plea for understanding. Why would a man like you risk this for someone like me? He looked up from the fire, his gaze meeting hers directly for the first time. The emptiness she had seen in the saloon was gone, replaced by something ancient and weary. He answered simply, his voice rough. You look like someone who wanted to be free, not bought. The words were a key, unlocking something deep inside her that she thought had rusted shut. He had not seen her as a soiled dove, a piece of property, a victim. He had seen the last, flickering ember of her spirit, the part of her that still remembered being a person. For the first time in a very long time, a tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. They traveled for days after that. The land was an enemy. They rode through rocky terrain that bruised the horses' hooves, were nearly caught in a flash flood that turned a dry wash into a raging brown torrent, and leaned into wind-blasted plateaus where the air itself felt like a physical force trying to push them back. Through it all, he was a constant, steady presence. He seemed to know the land, to read its moods and its dangers. He found water where she saw only rock, and shelter where she saw only open, empty space. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to trust him. The trust was not born of words, for he spoke little, but of actions. He always gave her the first drink from the canteen. He took the longer watch at night. He never once made a move that was anything but protective. One evening, as they shared another small meal by another small fire, she began to talk. The words came hesitantly at first, then in a flood, as if a dam had broken. She told him about her family's ranch, the Double C. She spoke of her father's pride in his herds and her mother's garden, a patch of impossible green in the dry country. She told him how Hargreaves had come with his offers, his smiles as false as a $3 bill. She recounted the threats, the dead cattle, the fence lines cut in the night. She described the day the sheriff brought them the news of her parents' death, his condolences as hollow as his eyes. She spoke of the forged deeds, the sham trial, and the chilling silence of the townsmen, men her father had helped, who stood by and watched as his daughter was sold to the man who had murdered him. Wade listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer condolences or outrage. He just listened, his expression unchanging, his attention absolute. He was a vessel, taking in the whole ugly story, and in his quiet acceptance, she felt a measure of peace. She had finally told someone who believed her. When she was done, she felt emptied out, but lighter. She looked at him, waiting for him to share something of himself, some small piece of his own story to bridge the gap between them. He revealed nothing of himself. He just stared into the fire, his face a shuttered mask. But later that night, after she had wrapped herself in the blanket and pretended to be asleep, she saw him. He was cleaning his rifle, a nightly ritual. The fire had burned down to embers, and in the faint, red glow, she saw that his hands, the same hands that were so steady on the reins and so deadly with a gun, were shaking. It was not a tremor from the cold. It was a deep, profound shudder that ran up from the core of him, a silent testament to the violence he had known and the ghosts that would not let him rest. He was just as broken as she was, and in that shared, unspoken brokenness, a fragile, dangerous bond began to form. The high desert gave way to foothills, which in turn bled into the steep, pine-choked slopes of the mountains. The air grew thin and cold, carrying the sharp scent of pitch and the promise of winter. Wade had been pushing them hard, his instincts telling him they were being followed, a persistent, unseen pressure at their backs. He found what he was looking for just as the sky began to spit the first tentative flakes of snow. An old trapper's cabin, nestled in a high meadow and half swallowed by aspens. It was a derelict thing, little more than a box of rotting logs with a caved-in section of roof, but it had 4 walls, a stone fireplace, and a door that hung crookedly on one leather hinge. It was shelter. It was enough. He helped Lena down from the horse, her body stiff and weary from the long ride. He settled the gelding in a small lean-to that was still mostly standing, giving it the last of their grain. Then he turned his attention to their temporary home, while Lena huddled inside, trying to coax a flame from the damp kindling left in the hearth. Wade worked with a grim, focused energy. He used the pry bar from his saddlebag to pull planks from the collapsed lean-to, patching the hole in the cabin's roof as best he could. He stretched the canvas tarp he carried over the 2 empty window frames, securing it with rusty nails he found in a corner. He was a man accustomed to shoring up defenses against a hostile world. By the time he was finished, the snow was falling in earnest, a thick, silent curtain that was quickly erasing their tracks and isolating them from the world. Inside, Lena had succeeded in starting a fire. The small blaze crackled and hissed, a fragile point of light and warmth against the growing gloom. The cabin was a pocket of crude safety in the vast, indifferent wilderness. She was sitting on the floor by the hearth, her back to him, rubbing her feet, the boots he had gotten for her. While sturdy, had not been kind to feet accustomed to softer wear. They were red and blistered. He came and sat on the other side of the fire, not speaking, and set a small pot of snow on the edge of the hearth to melt for coffee. After a while, she spoke, her voice soft and reflective, aimed at the flames more than at him. I used to dream about a place like this. A little cabin in the mountains, away from everything. A sad, faint smile touched her lips. Of course, in my dreams. The windows had glass, and the roof did not have a hole in it. She looked around the small, shadowed space. Still, it is quiet here. Her smile faded. I had those dreams before I knew what men could take from you. Wade said nothing. He just watched the snow melt. The silence between them filled by the crackle of the fire and the soft hiss of the snow against the hot stones of the chimney. He shared his last strips of jerky with her, and they drank the hot, bitter coffee from a single tin cup, passing it back and forth. The simple act felt strangely intimate. For a few hours, they were just a man and a woman, sharing a fire while a storm raged outside. There was no past, no future, only the fragile present. Lena looked at him, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight. The fear that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a deep, questioning vulnerability. She asked softly, "Are you going to leave me after the snow passes?" The question was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of the evening. It was the question that had been shadowing her for days. He was a drifter. Men like him did not stay. He had rescued her, but that did not mean he was hers to keep. She was preparing herself for the inevitable abandonment. He considered the question for a long time, his gaze fixed on the fire. He was a man who lived by a rigid, self-imposed code of non-involvement. To stay with her would be to break that code completely. To stay would be to invite the kind of pain he had sworn off forever. But to leave her, now that he had pulled her from the wreckage of her life, felt like a different kind of betrayal. He finally looked at her, his expression as serious as a deathbed vow. "If you ask me to, I will." The answer stunned her. It was not a promise to stay, but it was something far more profound. It was a promise of choice. He was giving her back a piece of the control that had been stolen from her. He was not her owner, not her keeper. He was a man who would respect her will, even if it meant leaving her alone in a world that had already tried to destroy her. Tears welled in her eyes, and this time she did not try to hide them. The peace was shattered the next afternoon. The snow had lessened to a light, steady fall, and Wade had gone out to hunt, hoping to find a rabbit or a squirrel for their dwindling food supply. He had been gone less than an hour when Lena heard the sound of horses, not the slow, plodding gait of a single rider, but the confident, jangling progress of a group. Her heart leaped into her throat. She peered through a small crack in the canvas covering the window. 4 men. They were hard-faced and heavily armed, the kind of men who worked for wages paid by men like Hargreaves. They were following their tracks, which the morning's new snow had not completely covered. They had found the cabin. She backed away from the window, her blood turning to ice. She was trapped. She looked around the small cabin, her eyes darting for an escape that did not exist. Her hand went to the heavy iron poker by the fireplace. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. Just as the riders were about to break through into the meadow, a single gunshot cracked through the silent air. It came from the dense stand of pines on the far side of the meadow. One of the riders grunted, clutching his shoulder as he toppled from his horse. The others immediately scattered, drawing their own weapons and taking cover behind trees, their faces a mixture of surprise and anger. Wade had circled around them. He was out there, alone, drawing their fire. Another shot rang out from a different position. Another man cried out and fell. Wade was moving, a ghost in the trees, using the landscape he knew so well. Lena could only watch in horrified fascination. The woods erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. The bandits fired wildly into the trees, their bullets thudding into trunks and whining through the air. Wade's shots, in contrast, were deliberate, spaced out, and lethally precise. He was not fighting a battle. He was conducting an execution. One of the remaining men made a desperate break for the cover of the cabin. He ran in a low crouch, his pistol firing blindly into the woods. He was almost to the door when Wade's rifle spoke again. The man's body jerked as if struck by a giant, invisible hand, and he collapsed face down in the snow a few feet from the door, a dark, rapidly spreading stain blooming on the back of his coat. The last man, seeing his companions fall, lost his nerve. He leaped onto his horse and spurted back the way he had come, fleeing for his life. Wade did not fire again. He let him go, a messenger to carry the tale of his failure back to Hargreaves. The silence that descended after the last gunshot was more profound and terrible than the noise had been. Lena stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, the iron poker still clutched in her hand, a splinter of wood, kicked up by a stray bullet that had struck the doorframe, had grazed her shoulder, a thin line of red against her pale skin. She barely felt it. After a few minutes, Wade emerged from the trees. He walked slowly, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He was not a savior returning from a noble victory. He was something else entirely. His face was a hard, emotionless mask. His duster was spattered with blood from where he had knelt to finish one of the wounded men. He was soaked in the grim reality of his work, silent, distant, and terrifying. He looked at the bodies in the snow with the detached air of a man looking at felled timber. Lena saw the side of him that she had only glimpsed before, the part of him that frightened her to the core. This was not just a quiet, protective drifter. This was a killer, a man who could snuff out human lives with a brutal, cold efficiency that was almost inhuman. He was a weapon, and he had just been used. He came into the cabin, his eyes sweeping over her, checking for injuries. He saw the scratch on her shoulder, but he did not move toward her. He went to the fireplace and began to methodically clean his rifle, his movements precise and automatic. Lena backed away from him and sat on a low stool in the corner, pulling her blanket around her. She could not speak. The words were frozen in her throat. She watched him, this stranger who had saved her life by becoming a monster. The man who had given her a choice by the fire last night seemed to have vanished, replaced by this cold, blood-soaked specter. She did not speak for hours. She just sat in her corner, shivering, while the snow fell outside, burying the dead. Night fell. Wade had dragged the bodies into the woods, out of sight. He rebuilt the fire and cooked the rabbit he had managed to shoot before the bandits arrived. He offered her a portion on a tin plate, but she could not eat. The smell of the cooked meat mingled in her mind with the coppery scent of blood, and her stomach churned. He sat by the fire, watching her. The distance between them a vast, frozen wasteland. He knew what she was seeing. He had seen that look in other people's eyes before. It was the look of fear and revulsion that good people reserved for men like him. He was poison. He had always known it. He had brought death to her doorstep, just as he had brought it to everyone he had ever tried to protect. Finally, he stood and came toward her. He carried a small piece of clean cloth in the canteen. He knelt in front of her. "Your shoulder," he said, his voice a low rasp. She flinched as he reached for her, but she did not pull away. His hands were gentle as he pulled back the collar of her dress and shirt to look at the wound. It was a shallow graze. Not serious, but it was bleeding sluggishly. He cleaned it carefully with the damp cloth. His touch was hesitant, his fingers barely brushing her skin. He was afraid of his own hands. She realized, afraid that the blood that stained them was somehow permanent, that he would soil her with his touch. He finished cleaning the small wound and pulled away, his task complete. He remained kneeling before her for a long moment, the space between them charged with the day's violence and the night's unspoken sorrow. He looked down at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. He was about to stand, to retreat back to his side of the fire, back to his solitary, haunted world. But then she whispered, her voice so quiet he almost did not hear it. It was the same line from her song, the same line that had first broken through his defenses in the saloon. But now, it had a new meaning. "I don't want to forget tonight." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. She was not looking at him with fear anymore. She was looking at him with a profound, aching sadness, and something else, understanding. She was not talking about the violence. She was talking about the moment of connection before it, the choice he had given her, the sight of him fighting for her, the terrible price he had paid to keep her safe. She did not want to forget any of it, the good and the terrible, because it was all part of the same story, their story. He did not move. He seemed frozen, caught between the instinct to flee and the unbearable pull of her words. He wore his hat low, the brim shadowing his face, a final piece of armor between him and the world. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached up and took it off. He let it fall from his hand. It landed softly on the dirt floor between them. It was an act of surrender. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of triumph. It was a slow, gentle, tentative kiss, as soft as the falling snow. It was a question and a prayer. He tasted of coffee and gunpowder and a loneliness so deep it felt like it could swallow the world. She answered his kiss, her lips parting slightly, a quiet acceptance of everything he was, the protector and the killer, the broken man who had saved her. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. In the flickering firelight, she saw the ghosts in his eyes, but for the first time, she was not afraid of them. She saw that they were just deep, unhealed wounds, just like her own. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the blanket he had laid out by the fire. He laid her down gently and then lay beside her, pulling a second blanket over them both. They made love by the light of the dying fire. It was not a feverish, desperate act. It was a slow, quiet coming together, an act not of passion, but of survival. It was two broken souls clinging to each other for warmth in the middle of a cold and dangerous world, seeking a moment of grace in the ruins of their lives. It was tender, it was sad, and it was a moment that neither of them would ever forget. The world returned slowly, in shades of gray. Morning seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls, the light soft and diffused by the still falling snow. Wade was awake, sitting with his back against the wall, watching the fire. He had not slept. Lena lay beside the hearth, wrapped in the blankets, the firelight casting a warm, gentle glow on her face. In sleep, the lines of fear and sorrow were erased, and she looked younger, like the rancher's daughter she was meant to be. He had spent the night guarding that peace, a silent, solitary vigil. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttered open and found his. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet, questioning stillness. The memory of the night before was a fragile, glowing ember between them. He had shared not his stories, but his silence, his touch, and in doing so had revealed more of his soul than words ever could. He passed her the tin cup, which he had already filled with hot coffee. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and the simple contact was as potent as a kiss. They sat that way for a long time, sipping the coffee, sharing the warmth of the small fire, while the snow fell in a silent, ceaseless whisper, sealing them in their temporary world. The bodies of the men he had killed were buried under a thick white shroud, the violence of yesterday temporarily erased by the purity of the snow. It was a fragile, impossible peace. Lena was the one who broke the silence. She was looking out at the snow falling through the hole in the roof, her expression clouded with a familiar sadness. She tried to hide the tears that welled in her eyes, turning her face away from him, but he saw the way her throat worked, the slight tremble in her hand as she set the cup down. "I don't know what happens after this," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "After the snow stops, after we leave this place." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes shining with a deep, heartbreaking despair. "I have never been anything but someone to take. My father's daughter, Hargreaves's property, a thing for men to want or to use. I don't know how to be anything else." Her words were a confession of the deepest wound she carried. He had freed her from the cellar, but he could not free her from the prison of her past, from the identity that had been beaten into her. Wade set his own cup down and moved closer, not touching her, but closing the distance between them. He looked at her, his gaze steady and direct, and the ghosts in his own eyes were quiet for once. "You are not mine to take," he said, his voice low and rough, but with a certainty that cut through her despair. "But you are someone I would give everything to protect." It was a vow. It was the truest thing he had ever said. It was not a promise of a future, of a home, of happiness. He had none of those things to give. It was the only thing a man like him had to offer, his life, standing between her and the world that would seek to harm her. It was everything. For Lena, who had never been offered anything without a price. It was a gift so profound she could not speak. She could only look at him while the tears she had tried to hide finally fell. Not in sorrow, but in a kind of wondering, painful relief. The snow fell for another day and another night. They spoke little, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, unspoken understanding. When the storm finally broke on the third morning, the world outside was a pristine, blinding expanse of white under a pale blue sky. The beauty of it was sharp and painful. It was a world they had to re-enter. Their destination was a town called Elk Hollow, a small logging community on the other side of the mountain pass. It was far from Hargreaves's influence, a place where she might be able to start over, to find work, to simply be anonymous. It was a slim hope, but it was the only one they had. They had not been traveling for more than a few hours. Wade's gelding struggling through the deep snow, when he reined in sharply. He held up a hand for silence, his head cocked, his eyes scanning the ridge ahead of them. Lena could see nothing but snow and trees. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders," he said, his voice grim. "Up ahead, blocking the pass." He slid from the saddle, moving in a low crouch to the edge of a rocky outcropping. He peered around it for a long time. When he came back, his face was set in hard, grim lines. "It is a posse, at least a dozen men. Miller is with them. They are not just looking, they are waiting. They knew we would have to come this way." Lena's heart sank, trapped. The brief, impossible hope of Elk Hollow dissolved into the cold mountain air. "What do we do?" Before Wade could answer, another sound reached them. A single horse, moving steadily up the trail behind them. Wade spun, his hand dropping to his gun, his body instantly shielding Lena's. He relaxed a fraction of a second later, a look of disbelief on his face. It was Elijah. He rode a sturdy draft horse, its breath pluming in the cold air. The old blacksmith was wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat and carried a long rifle across his saddle. His face was a mask of grim determination. "Figured you two might need a hand," Elijah said, his deep voice a welcome, grounding sound. "That last fella from the shootout made it back to town. Hargreaves is spitting fire. He sent Miller and every man he could buy out to hunt you down. They aim to make an example of you. Wade." "How did you find us?" Wade asked, his voice tight with a mixture of gratitude and concern for the old man's safety. "You left a trail a blind man could follow, if he knew what to look for." Elijah grunted. "You were a scout, were you not? You forget I was a quartermaster sergeant. Tracking men and supplies was my trade." He looked past them, toward the pass. "They have you boxed in." Wade nodded, his mind already working, calculating angles and odds. The odds were impossible. "Lena cannot go back," he said, more to himself than to Elijah. "And we cannot go forward." "There is another way," Elijah said. "An old game trail. It goes north, around the mountain. It is a hard ride, but it will get you to the other side of the pass, well clear of them. But it is a trail for one horse, not two, and it is too slow. They would see you long before you were clear." A plan formed in Wade's eyes, cold and clear as ice. He looked at Lena, his expression unreadable. "Elijah, You will take Lena. Lead her on that game trail. Do not stop until you reach Elk Hollow." "No," Lena said immediately, grabbing his arm. "I am not leaving you." The thought of it was a physical pain, a tearing sensation in her chest. "And what about you?" Elijah asked, already knowing the answer. "I am going to draw them away," Wade said, his gaze still on Lena. "I will lead them back down the mountain, toward the canyons. Give you the time you need." "That is a suicide run, son," Elijah said, his voice heavy. "It is the only way," Wade said. He turned to Lena, his hands gripping her shoulders. His touch was firm, insistent. "You have to go. You have to live. Do you understand?" "No," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Wade, please, do not do this." "I am not asking," he said, and his voice was hard. The voice of a man who had made a decision from which there was no turning back. It was the voice of the man who had cleaned his rifle after the shootout, a man who dealt in brutal necessities. He turned her toward Elijah. "Go, now." Elijah reached down and took Lena's arm. "He is right, child. It is the only chance we have." Tears streamed down Lena's face as Elijah pulled her up onto the horse behind him. She looked at Wade, her heart breaking. He stood there, alone in the snow, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving mountains. He looked back at her, and for a fleeting instant, the hardness in his eyes softened, and she saw the man who had let his hat fall to the floor. It was a look of profound, aching farewell. Then he turned, swung himself into his own saddle, and kicked his horse into a gallop. Riding straight out into the open, he fired a single shot into the air. From the ridge above, a chorus of shouts erupted. The trap was sprung. The chase was on. Wade did not look back. He rode hard and fast, back toward Calico Ridge, back toward the canyons, a lone rider with a dozen wolves at his heels. He rode with a reckless, desperate purpose. The posse, spurred on by Sheriff Miller's promises of Hargreaves's bounty, followed with a bloodthirsty enthusiasm. They were poor riders and worse shots, their bullets kicking up snow far behind him. Wade was a master of the land. He led them a grueling chase, down treacherous slopes and through thick stands of timber, always staying just far enough ahead to keep them coming. He was leading them to a place he had scouted in his mind, a narrow box canyon with steep, rocky walls. It was a death trap. As he galloped into the narrow opening, he leaped from his horse, slapping its rump to send it running deeper into the canyon as a decoy. He scrambled up the rocks, finding a ledge that gave him a clear field of fire. He was ready. The posse thundered into the canyon moments later, a jumble of men and horses. They saw Wade's horse at the far end and spurred their own mounts onward, whooping and firing their pistols. Wade's rifle answered. The first shot took the lead rider from his saddle, the second took another. The acoustics of the canyon amplified the sound of the rifle into a deafening roar. Panic erupted. The posse, trapped in the narrow space, was a tangle of easy targets. Wade worked the lever of his rifle with a cold, mechanical rhythm. He was no longer a man. He was a machine built for killing. Man after man fell from his saddle. Horses screamed and reared. It was a slaughter. He had killed most of them when a searing, white-hot pain tore through his side. A lucky shot from one of the deputies below had found its mark. The force of it knocked him from the ledge, and he tumbled down the rocks, his rifle flying from his grasp. He landed hard in the snow, the world spinning in a vortex of pain. He tried to push himself up, his hand going to the Colt on his hip, but his body would not obey. His side was a fountain of hot, sticky blood, soaking through his duster and into the snow. Through a haze of pain, he saw the remaining figures, Sheriff Miller and one deputy, approaching cautiously, their guns raised. The deputy saw Wade trying to draw his pistol and fired. The bullet struck Wade's gun hand, sending the Colt spinning away. Wade cried out, a raw, ragged sound, and collapsed back into the snow. Sheriff Miller walked up to him, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. He nudged Wade's wounded side with the toe of his boot, eliciting a groan of agony. "Well, well," the sheriff sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "Look what we have here, the big, tough drifter. Not so tough now, are you?" He looked around at the carnage, the bodies of his men littering the canyon floor. His smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flash of fury. "You are going to pay for this. Hargreaves wants you alive, but he did not say in how many pieces." Miller holstered his pistol and looked down at Wade, his expression one of pure contempt. "I have to admit, I do not understand you. All this, for what? For another soiled woman? A used-up piece of property not worth the bullet it would take to put her out of her misery? You could have just ridden on." Wade looked up at him, his vision blurring, his blood staining the snow a brilliant crimson. He thought of Lena, safe, riding with Elijah. He had bought her time. He had bought her a life. He managed a weak, bloody smile. Miller, enraged by his defiance, drew his gun again and aimed it at Wade's head. "Smile at this, you son of a bitch." A single sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the mouth of the canyon. Sheriff Miller's eyes went wide with surprise. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his back. He stood frozen for a second, a look of utter disbelief on his face. Then he made a soft, gurgling sound and pitched forward, landing face first in the snow beside Wade. The deputy stared, his jaw hanging open in shock. He looked toward the mouth of the canyon. Lena stood there, Elijah's long rifle in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. She had not gone. She had come back. Her face was pale and tear-streaked, but her hands were steady, and her eyes were filled with a cold, hard fire. The deputy, seeing his sheriff dead and the woman who was supposed to be a helpless victim holding a rifle with deadly intent, made his choice. He scrambled onto his horse and fled, not even bothering to fire a shot. Lena ran to Wade's side, dropping the rifle in the snow. "Wade!" she cried, falling to her knees beside him. She saw the blood, so much blood, and the terrible wound in his side. He looked up at her, his eyes struggling to focus. He saw her face, her beautiful, fierce face, and he knew she was safe. A faint smile touched his lips. "You came back," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was not going to let you die," she sobbed, pressing a piece of her cloak to the wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. He reached up with his good hand and touched her cheek. His eyes, which had held so many ghosts, seemed to clear for a moment. He looked at her, and only her. Then his hand fell away. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he fell into the deep, silent darkness of unconsciousness. The first thing he was aware of was the light. It was not the harsh, unforgiving glare of the sun on snow, but a soft, colored light, muted and gentle. It smelled of beeswax, old wood, and lye soap. He was lying on his back, on something soft, a cot. The ceiling above him was made of dark, heavy beams. A distant sound, the ringing of a bell, echoed from somewhere far away. He was not in the mountains. He was not in a canyon filled with dead men. Pain, a dull, throbbing beast, awoke in his side. He grunted, a low, involuntary sound, and tried to shift. A sharper, more insistent pain shot through him, and he fell back, his breath hissing between his teeth. "Be still." The voice was soft, close by his ear. He turned his head slowly, every muscle protesting. Lena was sitting in a simple wooden chair beside the cot. Her face was pale and etched with exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes. But those eyes, clear and blue, were fixed on him. They were filled with a fierce, protective light. She had a bowl of water and a cloth in her hands. "Lena," he breathed. The name was a prayer, a question, a confirmation. "I am here," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She dipped the cloth in the water and gently dabbed his forehead. The cool water was a balm. You have been sleeping for 3 days. He tried to piece it together. The canyon, the blood in the snow, Miller's sneering face, Lena with a rifle in her hands. Where? Elk Hollow, she answered. We are in the back of the town's church. The pastor and his wife, they are good people. Elijah brought us here. She gestured with her head. On the other side of the small, curtained-off room, the old blacksmith sat sleeping in a chair, his head slumped on his chest. The posse. Gone, she said. The one who ran back to Calico Ridge told a wild story. Said a lone bounty hunter had tracked a ring of slavers to their mountain hideout and took them all down to free me. He said the sheriff was in on it. By the time anyone from Calico Ridge could have come looking for the truth, the story had set like cement. The folks here, they think you are a hero. She gave a small, weary smile. The U.S. Marshal for this territory is due in a month. Hargreaves will have some questions to answer. You are free, Wade. We both are. He absorbed this slowly. Free. It was a foreign concept. For a decade, he had been free to wander, but he had never been free of his past. Now, the law that might have hunted him for the events in the canyon saw him as a hero. It was a strange, undeserved grace. He looked at Lena, at the way she watched him, her hands never straying far, as if she could keep him tethered to the world of the living through sheer force of will. She had not left his side. For 3 days, she had been his anchor. The realization settled in his chest, a feeling so warm and heavy it was almost painful. He was in her debt, a debt a man like him could never repay. He was broken, a drifter with a bloody past and a future that promised nothing but more of the same. He had brought death and violence to her, just as he had feared. His body was proof of it, the fire in his side a constant reminder of the price of his involvement. She had a chance now, a real one. She could build a new life here in Elk Hollow, a life of peace. She could not do that with a man like him, a walking ghost, a magnet for trouble. He would only be a burden, a constant reminder of the horrors she had endured. He loved her enough to know he had to leave her. He made the decision in the quiet moments of the following days. He watched her as she changed his bandages, her touch gentle and sure. He listened as she read to him from a worn Bible the pastor's wife had lent her, her voice a soft, soothing melody. He saw the way she would sometimes stare out the window, a distant, haunted look in her eyes, and he knew her wounds were as deep as his, just hidden from sight. Every moment of her quiet care was another twist of the knife of his decision. He had to leave. For her sake. He waited until the night of the 4th day. The doctor, a gruff but kind man, had declared him weak but out of danger. The fever had broken. He could stand, with effort. Elijah had gone to find work at the local smithy, promising to return in the morning. Lena, exhausted past the point of resistance, had finally fallen into a deep sleep in her chair, her head resting on her arms on the edge of his cot. The church was silent, lit by a single candle left burning on a small table. He moved with an agonizing slowness, his patched-up sides screaming with every motion. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet touching the cold stone floor. He stood, his body trembling with weakness, his hand braced against the wall. For a long moment, he stood there, looking at her sleeping form. Her face, so peaceful in the candlelight, was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Leaving her was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than facing a dozen guns, harder than burying his family. He memorized the line of her cheek, the gentle curve of her lips. A single, hot tear escaped his eye and tracked a path through the grime on his cheek. He wiped it away, angry at his own weakness. His clothes were cleaned and folded on a nearby chest. He dressed slowly, his movement stiff and clumsy. His gun belt was there, too. He strapped it on, the familiar weight a cold, unwelcome comfort. His hat was on the chest. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the worn brim. He looked at Lena one last time, a silent, desperate farewell. Then he turned and, moving like a shadow, limped toward the main chapel, toward the heavy doors that would lead him back out into the night, back to his solitary, wandering existence. He had his hand on the iron latch of the door when her voice came out of the darkness behind him. "You were not just going to leave, were you?" He froze, his back to her. He did not turn around. He could not bear to see the look on her face. He had failed. Even in this, he had failed. She came to stand a few feet behind him. He could feel her presence, a warmth in the cold, cavernous space. "I knew you would try this," she said, her voice not angry, but filled with a deep, knowing sadness. "It is what you do, is it not? You save people, and then you ride away, so you do not have to watch the rest." He finally turned, slowly. She stood in the nave of the church, her form illuminated by the candles on the altar. She was not crying. Her expression was calm, her gaze steady. She had grown in the past weeks, from a frightened girl into a woman of formidable strength, a woman who saw right through him. "You have a chance here, Lena," he said, his voice a rough, pained whisper. "A good life. You do not need a man like me dragging you down." "A man like you?" she said, taking a step closer. "What kind of man is that? The kind who walks into a town and saves a stranger from being beaten to death? The kind who breaks a woman out of a cellar and asks for nothing? The kind who would ride into a dozen guns to give that woman a chance to be free?" Her voice grew stronger with every question. "Is that the kind of man you are?" "I am a killer, Lena," he said, the words torn from the deepest, ugliest part of his soul. "I bring death. I have my whole life. Look at me. I am half crippled. I am no good for you." "You did not bring death to me," she said, her voice softening. She took another step, closing the space between them until she was standing right in front of him. She looked at the wound in his side, at his battered hand, at the deep weariness in his eyes. "You brought me life, and I know what it costs. I saw it in your eyes in the cabin. I see it now." She reached up and gently touched his cheek. "I have spent so long trying to forget, forgetting the day my parents died, forgetting the sound of Hargreaves's voice, forgetting the faces of the men in the saloon." She looked directly into his eyes, her own shining with an unbearable intensity. She whispered the words that had become their creed, their history, their future. "I don't want to forget tonight, or you." He stood there, a broken man in a holy place, and her words washed over him. A benediction, an absolution. She was not asking him to be whole. She was not asking him to be a hero. She was asking him to be her partner in survival, to be her fellow witness to the pain and the beauty of their shared story. She was choosing him, not in spite of his scars, but because of them. He felt the walls inside him, the ones he had spent a decade building, crumble into dust. With a hand that trembled slightly, he reached up and took off his hat. He let it fall. It landed on the stone floor at their feet with a soft, final sound. It was the second time he had surrendered, and this time it was for good. He pulled her to him and kissed her, a deep, searching kiss under the watchful eyes of the saints in the stained glass windows. It was not a kiss of survival, but of beginning. It was a promise, made in the quiet candlelight, to build a life out of the ashes. Weeks later, the wind still howled across the high plains, a long, mournful cry that swept over what was left of the Calder ranch. It was a landscape of ghosts, the charred skeletons of the main house and the barn stark against the new green of the spring grass. It was a place of scorched earth and bitter memories. But there was life there now. A small, sturdy cabin, built from fresh-cut pine, stood near the creek. Smoke curled from its new stone chimney, and in the field, a man and a woman were building a fence. The work was hard. The man, Wade Thatcher, moved with a pronounced limp, a permanent reminder of the canyon. He would carry that bullet in his side for the rest of his days. The woman, Lena Calder, still flinched at loud, sudden sounds, the echo of a scream or a gunshot never fully leaving her. They were both scarred, inside and out. They were not the people they had been before Calico Ridge. He held a post steady while she tamped the earth around it with a heavy bar. She finished and leaned on the bar, breathing heavily, wiping a sheen of sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. She looked at the long, straight line of new fence posts, a tangible mark of their progress, a line drawn against the wilderness, a declaration of a new beginning. She looked at Wade. He was watching her, a faint, tired smile on his face. She smiled back. It was a quiet smile, not of joy, but of a deep, hard-won peace. It was the smile of two people who had walked through hell and found each other on the other side. They had not forgotten. They had simply learned how to build a life that was strong enough to hold all the memories, the good and the terrible. The wind howled across the land, the same lonely, desolate sound it had always made. But tonight, there was a fire inside the cabin, and no one had to forget. Thank you for being with us through this journey. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments to connect with fellow fans of the West. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and do not forget to share your thoughts with us in English.